This is video 1 of week 6, the first one out of 2 on the relationship between multilingualism and cognition. So the interaction between language and cognition or intelligence has a long tradition in the psychological literature, psycholinguistics, linguistics itself, philosophy. The issue has been addressed from many points of view, but it's been lately that it has taken a prominence as a point of inquiry of its own. So in this class and next, we're going to see a little bit the conceptual basis of all this research, and we're going to review a few studies, some of them classic and some of them more recent. So the point of departure of the main idea of this line of research is that we all know that experience modifies skill, which means that when you learn something, the more you practice it, the better you get at it. So that is an observation that we all have experience of. But actually, when we have looked at it from the neurological perspective, we have seen in animal models that experience modifies brain structure, so the physical part of the mind. So if experience has the ability, the potentiality to change brain structure, we might think which kind of experiences might do that. So for example, musical experience, we say that children who learn music learn mathematics faster or more easily, generally speaking, than children who do not learn music, even though you can learn mathematics without music, obviously, right? But there might be that there are some kind of experiences, some kind of learnings that modify our mind, our brain even directly. So language is an experience. So the question is then, well, does language as an experience modify our mind, our brain? Do different linguistic experiences determine or condition the different minds, different even brains at the neurological level? You see this idea of determination in many authors. Let me give you a quote here of a classic Bialystok, Ellen Bialystok, in her 2001 seminal work. She says verbatim, "Words can determine our ideas because they focus our attention on certain concepts at the expense of others and invoke assumptions that may never be made explicit." Okay, so when you learn a word, you learn not only the word, but the concept that the word denotes, and you word by word, you kind of build a conceptual system. So the words will determine your conceptual system, your ideas, your mind, your model of the world, after all. Okay, this idea is within the tradition that has long tradition that is known as linguistic determinism, which is also known as linguistic relativity, and following the proponents of that, or the most famous proponents of that hypothesis, the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis. So this is a tradition, and we're going to look at it a little bit at what that tradition says. So linguistic relativity originates from the work of Edward Sapir and Benjamin Whorf. Those are two American linguists that proposed these ideas, right? So Whorf actually was an insurance agent, and he was a linguist by vocation and by hobby, if you want. But his main income came from being an insurance agent, and he was in charge of investigating the origin of fires, industrial fires especially, and he had to kind of investigate whether there had been foul play or it had been an accident, so that the insurance would be refunding the expenses or not, right? And he observed that in one fire that had happened in some kind of factory, that there were some containers that had been used to contain some flammable product, and they were empty, and they were labeled as empty, and they were put in the empty container section of the factory. And then the factory workers, when they had their cigarette breaks, they were allowed to smoke only in the area where the empty containers were, because the other containers were full of flammable substances. So then it was too dangerous. But with the empty containers, then they could smoke. So one of the fires had originated because one of the workers had thrown into one of these empty containers a cigarette butt that was still lit. And then because the containers, even though they were empty of substance, they were not empty of the fumes of that flammable substance, then that had exploded and had made a fire in the factory. So he concluded that even though there was no ill will and there was no bad practice on the part of the factory, the problem was on the labeling. The problem was that since those containers were labeled, were identified and named as empty, they were also identified as safe, right? So then the problem, he said, was not on the containers themselves, but it was on the language that was used in the factory. So he reasoned that, language was making these people understand the containers in a certain way, and that had catastrophic consequences. So he went on to develop this idea of language determining how we see the world. And then he studied very famously the concept of time in Hopi, which is a northwest or southwest North American language. And he is very interesting how he identified that the way we represent time, which is not something that we have a direct experience with, varies according to our culture. Actually, this is not an example from Worf, but my favorite example comes from the Aymara and how they talk about time. So we always think that our past is behind us and our present is in front of us. Our present is here, but our future is in front of us. So when we walk through life, so to speak, we walk towards the future, to the front of us, looking at the future. Now the Aymara have a very different perception of it. So they think that the past is in front of us and the future is behind us. Okay, so for the Aymara, that makes sense because the past is in front of us and that's how we can see it, while the future being behind us, since we don't have our vision behind for everything that's behind us, we cannot see the future. Okay, and that determines language, right? So while we move forward into the future and we are going towards something that we imagine for the future, the Aymara walk blindly backwards to the future. Okay, so we talk in language, we say forward, where the Aymara said backwards, towards the future. Okay, so the language determines the concept of time, or the concept of time determines language, and in any case, those two are in consonance and they vary culturally. So if you speak one language or another, you learn the concept of time at the conceptual level in one way or another. In that sense, your language, immersed in a culture, of course, your language determines your conception of a given concept. This idea is expressed in this quote that I'm going to read with you by Worf, the original 1940 work. And he says, "We dissect nature along the lines laid down by our native languages. We cut nature up, organize it into concepts, and ascribe significances as we do, largely because we are parties to an agreement to organize it in this way. An agreement that holds throughout our speech community, our language, and is codified in the patterns of our language. We cannot talk at all except by subscribing to the organization and classification of data which the agreement decrees." Okay, so in a sense, we cannot escape from this codified reality that we learn when we learn a language. This is the core of this idea that our linguistic makeup determines our mental makeup, the linguistic relativity hypothesis. Okay, a modern consequence, or a modern, this has been taken up by feminist linguistics and feminist theorists in general, right? This idea that language determines already our reality. So if we want to change the reality, we might as well start by changing language. You know, people like Simone de Beauvoir in the 20th century, she's a famous feminist that said that one is not born woman, one becomes woman by socialization. Okay, so if we don't like the role that is assigned to us, we might as well change society. We need to change society, not the individual alone. Okay, this idea of relativity comes, and it's not coincidental, comes from this, also has a representation in the work of Albert Einstein, the theory of relativity. So the word, if it sounded familiar to you from physics, is because it's the same word, and that's not coincidental, because these theories were developed at the same time when people were starting to think that there were more than one way of looking at things according to point of view. Sigmund Freud, for example, which is also coetaneous with these figures, he put forth the idea that behind our conscious mind, behind our thoughts, our conscious thoughts that we are aware of, there might be other thoughts that we are not aware of that are determining precisely those thoughts, and especially determining our behavior, right? So this idea that there might be more to it than just the surface of our mind has that tradition too. Noam Chomsky is inheritor of those share of all these ideas too, when he talks about the difference between language and between performance and competence, or I language and E language, right? So that there might be in this idea of the iceberg, there might be more than meets the eye, there might be more than the tip of the iceberg. There might be all these structures that we cannot see, but that are in place and that are determined by language. Alexander Luria, that we have seen also before, he also proposed that our brain, our mind, but the brain also is constructed, that it is not representing the world as it is, but that we actually construct our ideas of the world as we develop, not only absorb it as it is, and that is also within this idea of determinism, and language would be a privileged tool to construct your idea of the world. Okay. So from all of these theorists and philosophers and linguists and psychologists and even physicists, we have this general idea that multilingualism, that language might have an impact on our vision of the world, right? So if you bring those ideas to the research on multilingualism, you end up with questions such as the following. So, for example, are multilingual children aware that they are learning and then using more than one language? So do they have metalinguistic cognition, meaning if they know that they're learning more than one language, are they aware that of that, even if it's just the issue of just having two systems, but also potentially two points of view, right? Now, if language conditions our thought, at least to some extent, having metalinguistic cognition, knowing that you are having two or more than two conceptual systems being encoded in the language, so having metalinguistic cognition might be important to be able to escape such a determinism, right? So first, you need to know your prisons before you break free of your prisons. So if multilingual children and then adults have a privileged window into the way language determines thought, just because they are bombarded with potentially incompatible versions of, uh, of, of the world. So could they escape it better, right? So then would that mean that multilinguals can see the world from different perspectives? Does that come with having metalinguistic cognition? And what consequences might that have with cognitive and personal properties such as empathy? If you can see the world from the point of view of another person, does that give you more empathy? How about problem solving? We know that the best way to solve a problem is to look at it from different points of view, and then the solution might actually come, because if it doesn't come from one point of view, it might come from another one, or from the combination of several points of view. And eventually, would that help you with having a more objective idea or representation of the world, if you can see it from different points of view, right? So in the way that all of these general intuitions are formulated in modern psycholinguistics or even philosophy, and that has a lot of influence from the evolutionary thinking, is the following. What are the cognitive costs and benefits of having and using two or more languages? Okay, in evolutionary theory, which is the framework that most of science inserts itself nowadays, we talk about costs and benefits, right? So if we are going to get some benefits of this metalinguistic cognition, do they also come with costs? So I'm going to present to you several other questions that you might encounter that all kind of fall within this umbrella of multilingualism research on the relationship between having more than one language versus having only one, for example, in modern inquiry. Okay, so for example, the first one is, how is the mental organization of two languages different from that of one, right? If you're going to compare it, then you have to first characterize your object of study, right? For example, are there various levels of language, such as phonology, syntax, semantics, and pragmatics, isolated within the bilingual's knowledge of an individual language, or part of a shared resource? That's the first thing that you have to approach, is how is the representation, how is the different levels of language representation or language operation represented in the brain, and whether there is a difference between having only one of those systems in your mind or having more than one. And then, of course, then the interaction of those systems, how is that possible, and how does it work? Do the systems, the linguistic systems, meaning the different languages, are they impermeable to each other, and each one of them are encapsulated in their own architectural building, or do they interact? Are they permeable? Are grammars permeable with each other? This is the field of language contact. And of course, the center of this research on the relationship between language and mind is on meaning, right? So the first thing that we need to clarify is how each language connect with a system of meanings in multilinguals, right? So are the two languages alternative labeling systems for the same concepts? Or does each language identify a different set of concepts and experiences for children? So, for example, if you have language A that connects you to meanings capital A, and language E that connects you to meanings capital E, are those in a coordinate bilingualism, in the words of Weinreich, organization, in which those are two different systems, and they might have a translation mechanism, if you want, between the two of them, but they are basically two different systems. So language A gives you a whole a conceptual representation, and language E gives you a kind of independent conceptual representation, and you are able to just live with the coexistence of both, right? Another idea is instead that you have two languages, or two labels for each concept, if you want, but the concept itself is kind of maybe a compromise between the one that is encoded by language A and the one that is encoded by language E. But you have one simple concept, so to speak, that receives two labels. And finally, the other possibility is that you have a subordinate bilingualism situation in which language E basically is just translated at the conceptual level into language A, which is the one that determines the concepts, and you basically have just a monolingual conceptual system. It's just that you have it encoded in language A properly, but language E is an alternative labeling of it, but that contributes nothing, so to speak, to the conceptual system. So those are different ways in which language and meaning might be related. Other questions that have been asked in the research on the relationship between multilingualism and cognition are the following. For example, the first one is, does language knowledge change across the lifespan and across experience and use changes, right? So can it be that having different experiences, different linguistic experiences, not only comparing individuals, but say within the individual as the individual ages or the life circumstances of that individual change, does that have an impact on their minds, on their conceptual systems, and on their cognitive abilities even? Okay. Another one is, does learning or having two languages heighten one's awareness of specific linguistic devices in both? Does knowing more than one language help you with yet another one? How do you use your linguistic knowledge of how language in general, how human language works? Does that help you in understanding an additional language, for example, right? If you have two languages, do you make some unconscious comparisons between the two, and that gives you an understanding of how grammar works and things like that. Okay. Another one is, do multilinguals see the world differently or have different personalities even according to which language they are using? If you see the world differently according to the language, do you actually have different personalities? When I speak this language, I find myself being more amicable or being more strict, or being more uptight, or being, whatever it is that is associated with your experience of that language, and maybe even with the concepts that language encodes. Does it determine your personality? And what does that mean if you have more than one language? If you're multilingual, do you have multiple personalities to a certain extent? That's a research question that, believe it or not, is active in many research agendas. Another one is, do multilingual people have better social skills because they have kind of more emotional intelligence because they can see the world from different perspectives? So does that make them more able to relate to people who might be different from them? Another one is even that, do we smile and frown differently in different languages? This might look to you very concrete, but eventually you want to answer these questions because people do have a certain intuition of answers to those questions, but then you want to know scientifically what truth there is to it, right? So could it be that we react, our facial expressions are different in one language than in another? And remember babies, right? Remember that they could actually very early on identify which language was being spoken according to the mouth movements and all that. And we know that there are gestures that are associated with one culture or another culture, even with one language and another language. So what happens in multilinguals when they have those different languages? Is that represented or is that reflected in different behavior at the basic level of smiling or frowning and so on? Okay, and then finally, what about speaking three languages as opposed to two? Is it better? Is it better to get 3 points of view instead of 2? Does that help you? Or just with knowing that there's more than one point of view, is that enough to make you a better problem solver, for example, and so on? Okay, so these are all questions that appear in the literature, and if you're interested in any of these, there are scientific articles that have targeted all of these questions. And I'm going to leave this video here and see you in the next video.